What happens when one of television's most respected journalists ambushes a beloved royal figure on live TV? You won't believe what unfolded when Princess Catherine sat down for what she thought would be a thoughtful discussion about her charitable work, only to find herself facing a relentless line of questioning that left viewers around the world stunned. The tension inside Studio 3A last night was so thick you could cut it with a knife. What began as a polite exchange quickly spiraled into one of the most explosive on-air confrontations in recent memory. But before we dive into the full story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and share your thoughts below, because you'll be shocked when you see how George Stephanopoulos threw journalistic courtesy out the window and went straight for the jugular. The atmosphere at the ABC News studio crackled with energy as Princess Catherine gracefully took her seat across from Stephanopoulos, her signature smile glowing under the harsh studio lights. She had agreed to the interview to highlight her groundbreaking mental health initiatives and the recent successes of her early years foundation. Dressed in a navy blue blazer, she radiated calm professionalism, clearly expecting a meaningful conversation about causes close to her heart. Stephanopoulos, however, had other plans. Sitting upright, notes spread before him like ammunition. The veteran journalist's piercing gaze made it clear this would be no soft interview. Behind his well-practiced smile was a different agenda, one Catherine's team hadn't been briefed on. "Your Royal Highness, thank you for joining us tonight," he began, his tone carrying that familiar weight of authority. "I know you're here to discuss your charitable endeavors, but I think our viewers deserve to hear about some of the more pressing issues surrounding the monarchy right now." Catherine's smile flickered, just for a moment, betraying her surprise at the sudden shift. She had been told this conversation would focus on her work with children and families, not royal controversies. Still, her years of royal training kicked in as she responded smoothly. "Of course, George. I'm always happy to discuss the important work we're doing. The Early Years Foundation has made remarkable progress supporting families across the Commonwealth, and I'm particularly excited about our new mental health resources for young mothers." But Stephanopoulos wasn't interested in small talk. Leaning forward, he asked pointedly, "That's admirable, certainly. But let's address the elephant in the room. Your family has been under unprecedented scrutiny, particularly over transparency and accountability. Critics say the royal institution operates in an outdated bubble, disconnected from the struggles of ordinary people." The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Catherine's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She'd been prepared for challenging questions, but not this ambush. "I think that's an unfair characterization, George," she replied evenly, though a hint of steel entered her voice. "William and I work tirelessly to understand and address the challenges families face today. Our engagements aren't photo opportunities. They're genuine efforts to make a meaningful difference." Her calm only seemed to embolden Stephanopoulos. "But isn't there something inherently problematic about inherited privilege in the 21st century?" he pressed. "You live in palaces while families struggle to afford housing. You wear gowns worth thousands while some people are choosing between heating and eating." The words hit like a blow, precise, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Around the studio, crew members exchanged uneasy glances. This was not the respectful interview they'd expected to witness. Catherine drew a steadying breath. "That's a gross oversimplification of both our role and our lifestyle," she said, her voice cool but firm. "The properties we use are held in trust for the nation. The work we do generates significant economic benefit for the country. And I would challenge anyone to look at my schedule and suggest I'm not fully committed to serving the public good." Stephanopoulos sensed he'd struck a nerve and pressed harder. "But serving the public good shouldn't require hereditary titles and taxpayer-funded security details, should it?" Stephanopoulos pressed, his voice deceptively calm. "In an era where every institution is being questioned and reformed, why should the monarchy be exempt from scrutiny, including questions about its very existence?" The question was pure dynamite, philosophical, provocative, and designed to corner Catherine into defending not just her own work, but the entire constitutional system she embodied. Her hands, which had been resting neatly in her lap, tensed ever so slightly. It was clear now just how far Stephanopoulos was prepared to push. "George," Catherine began, her voice steady but edged with steel, I came here tonight to talk about initiatives that are genuinely helping vulnerable children and families. If you wanted a debate about constitutional monarchy, you should have made that clear when your producers reached out to my office. The rebuke landed with precision, cool, regal, and unmistakable. But Stephanopoulos didn't flinch. If anything, he seemed invigorated, like a prosecutor sensing the witness had just revealed a weakness. With respect, Your Royal Highness, he said, leaning forward slightly, constitutional questions are exactly what our viewers want answered. The American people fought a revolution to free themselves from royal rule. Many wonder why we should celebrate, or even give airtime to, institutions that seem fundamentally undemocratic. The studio fell utterly silent, the hum of the cameras the only sound. Every eye was fixed on Catherine. What flashed in her eyes then wasn't anger. It was resolve. A quiet, unyielding determination that suggested the diplomatic princess was done playing defense. When she leaned forward, the shift was unmistakable. The poised royal at ribbon cuttings and charity galas was gone. In her place sat a woman ready to fight back with the full weight of her intellect and authority. "George," she said, her voice ringing through the studio. "Let me be absolutely clear. You invited me here under false pretenses, and now you're using your platform to stage what can only be described as a politically motivated attack. The American people you claim to represent," she continued, her tone rising with quiet intensity, "include millions who value the cultural and diplomatic ties between our nations. Ties built on mutual respect, not division." Stephanopoulos blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her directness. He had expected royal restraint, not a counterpunch. "Your Royal Highness," he said, regaining his composure, "I'm simply asking legitimate questions about accountability. Surely you don't expect immunity from the same scrutiny every public figure faces." "Scrutiny is one thing, George," Catherine shot back, her words now carrying unmistakable edge. "What you're doing is something else entirely. You're not asking about policy or impact. You're questioning the very legitimacy of institutions that have underpinned democratic nations for centuries. That isn't journalism. That's activism masquerading as an interview." The accusation hit like a thunderclap. Around the studio, producers exchanged uneasy looks, suddenly aware they were witnessing something unscripted and potentially historic. Stephanopoulos' face flushed slightly, the only visible crack in his composure. "I resent the implication that my questioning lacks integrity," he said, his voice tight. "I've been doing this for decades. I have every right to explore these topics with any guest who appears on this program. And I," Catherine replied without hesitation, "have every right to call it out when those questions cross the line from fair inquiry into ambush. Your producers assured my office this would focus on mental health and charitable work. Instead, you've chosen to confront me with partisan talking points that have nothing to do with the causes we're actually here to discuss." The air in the studio was electric, part outrage, part awe. What had begun as an interview was now a duel. The word Republican, pointedly referencing anti-monarchist sentiment rather than American politics, was delivered with surgical precision. Catherine knew exactly what game Stephanopoulos was playing, and she wasn't about to feign ignorance for the sake of diplomatic nicety. Stephanopoulos leaned back in his chair, a gesture that looked like retreat but felt more like recalibration. "Perhaps we should turn to some of the more recent controversies then," he said smoothly. "There have been questions about the royal family's response to social issues, concerns over transparency within your charitable foundations, and, of course, the ongoing debate about whether the monarchy remains relevant in addressing modern challenges." "There it is," Catherine said, a bitter smile flickering across her face. "When direct attacks on constitutional democracy don't land, pivot to vague accusations about controversies and questions. George, this is beneath you, and it's certainly beneath the standards your network claims to uphold." Her words struck their target. Stephanopoulos' jaw tightened, the flash of irritation impossible to disguise. The power dynamic in Studio 3A had shifted completely. What had started as an ambush was fast becoming a masterclass in how to dismantle one. "Your Royal Highness," Stephanopoulos said, forcing composure, "I think you're being overly sensitive to legitimate journalistic inquiry. Public figures must be prepared to answer difficult questions about their roles and responsibilities." Catherine's laugh was short and cold. "Overly sensitive? George, I've done hundreds of interviews about real issues: policy, budgets, program effectiveness. What you're doing isn't difficult questioning. It's a predetermined narrative, crafted for sound bites to fit conclusions you've already reached. The accusation landed like a blow. For a journalist who built a career on the image of objectivity, being accused of pushing a pre-written story was professional. Kryptonite. Stephanopoulos' response would decide everything and whether this confrontation simmered down or detonated completely. I reject that characterization entirely, he said sharply, his voice rising despite his best efforts to contain it. My questions reflect legitimate concerns shared by many Americans about the role of inherited privilege in modern society. Catherine didn't hesitate. And there's the mask slip, she countered coolly. You're not speaking for the American people, George. You're pushing your political agenda, using the authority of this program as cover. The public is perfectly capable of forming its own opinions about international relationships and constitutional systems without being spoon-fed your loaded questions. The air in the studio crackled. Catherine had just accused one of America's most prominent journalists of bias and manipulation on his own show. The veteran broadcaster now faced a choice: de-escalate and salvage his credibility, or double down and risk disaster. In that moment, pride won. Stephanopoulos' expression hardened, his frustration breaking through the polished facade. He leaned forward, pen in hand, pointing it like a weapon. Your Royal Highness, he snapped, with all due respect, you can't walk into an American television studio and lecture me about journalism when your entire existence is built on a system that denies basic democratic principles. You want to talk about predetermined narratives? Your life is one, predetermined by birthright, funded by taxpayers who have no say in the matter. The words hit the air like a detonation. The studio froze. Even the camera operators stood motionless, stunned by what they'd just witnessed. Stephanopoulos had crossed every professional and diplomatic line simultaneously. In the control room, producers were frantically gesturing for him to stop, to pull back, to salvage something, but it was far too late. Catherine's reaction was immediate and devastating in its composure. Without a word, she reached up and unclipped her microphone. The gesture was calm, deliberate, the kind of quiet defiance that carried far more power than any raised voice could. She placed the mic neatly on the small table beside her, as if drawing a line in the sand. When she looked up, her eyes locked on Stephanopoulos with the cool intensity of centuries of royal authority. George, she said, her voice low but cutting through the studio like glass. In 30 years of public service, I have never witnessed such unprofessional, disrespectful behavior from a member of the media. You have violated every principle of journalistic ethics, betrayed the trust of your producers, and embarrassed yourself, your network, and your profession. She rose to her feet with graceful precision. The simple act seemed to shrink Stephanopoulos in his chair. He looked smaller now, defensive, while she radiated unflinching control. Furthermore, she continued, her tone now coolly intellectual, your personal attacks on constitutional monarchy reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of how democratic systems function. The United Kingdom has operated as a democracy longer than the United States has existed. Our constitutional framework has inspired democratic movements around the world. Your Royal Highness, I think you're overreacting, Stephanopoulos began, half rising from his seat. I am not finished. The words cracked like thunder. He froze, sinking back into his chair as the power dynamic in the room flipped entirely. You want to talk about predetermined narratives? She continued. You invited me here under false pretenses, not to inform but to provoke. This isn't journalism, George. It's entertainment dressed up as news. Catherine turned and began walking toward the studio exit, the sound of her heels echoing in the tense silence. But before reaching the door, she stopped. Slowly, she turned back, the final deliberate act of a woman in total command of the moment. The saddest part about all this, she said quietly, is what could have been. We could have had a meaningful conversation about mental health, about the resources families desperately need across America. But instead, you chose to waste this opportunity chasing viral outrage. Her tone was measured, but it carried the weight of moral authority. Stephanopoulos made a last, faltering attempt to recover. Your Royal Highness, surely we can continue this discussion in a more productive— No, George, we cannot. The finality in her voice was absolute. You've made it abundantly clear that you're not interested in conversation. You're interested in spectacle, in gotcha moments and manufactured controversy. I won't be part of that circus. She turned again and walked toward the exit. The rhythmic sound of her footsteps filled the silent studio. Each click of her heels a punctuation mark on the career-defining disaster unfolding behind her. But she wasn't quite finished. At the door, she paused and delivered one last blow, measured, factual, devastating. For what it's worth, she said without turning around, the mental health initiatives we tried to discuss have already helped more than 2 million families across the Commonwealth access critical support. Perhaps next time you'll consider covering stories that actually matter, instead of manufacturing controversies to feed your own ego. And with that, Princess Catherine walked out of Studio 3A. Behind her, a stunned silence lingered. Stephanopoulos sat frozen, his face a portrait of shock and dawning realization. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every frame of his humiliation. Well, we'll be right back, he finally stammered. But the voice that had once commanded Sunday mornings now sounded small, hollow, defeated. The damage was irreversible. As the broadcast cut to commercial and the studio lights dimmed, everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed television history. Not the ambush Stephanopoulos had planned, but the moment Princess Catherine turned an attempted takedown into a masterclass in dignity under fire. In trying to corner her, he had instead exposed himself and reminded the world that grace, when wielded with intelligence and conviction, can be the most formidable weapon of all.